Hey guys, it's time for the week in review when we take a deep breath and a step back and take a look at this week's news and see what we can learn. And this week I started off with a really interesting question for you about whether or not you felt America was more divisive than ever before. And you sent some remarkable answers. A lot of you had a lot of different opinions on this. And it was interesting to see your thoughts on it all. In fact, many of you had a similar question, though, about whether or not social media exacerbated this feeling of divisiveness. And you wondered, would that really be the reality if we were all in the same room face to face together? It's a big question. Some of you also wondered what this potential divisiveness meant to America overall. And that's a really interesting philosophical question that's been asked over the years. You know, many critics of America have thought that our freedom to have these public debates will eventually be our undoing. That eventually it'll rip up the seams of our social fabric and that the country will unravel. It hasn't happened yet, but I hear that question being asked a lot. And so that led me to another interesting question for this week's news that was punctuated by two very different stories. And that question was this: what's the biggest threat to America right now? The enemy on the outside or the enemy within? And here's why I started thinking about that. On the same day, two drastically different stories. You had the anniversary of the raid on bin Laden's compound in Pakistan, and you have a Senate hearing that was focusing more or less on the special counsel investigation through interviewing the Attorney General Barr. And how do these stories even relate? Well, on the one hand, you have bin Laden, and as the leader of Al-Qaeda, the mastermind of 9/11, being a true and real threat to America. I'll get to that more in a moment. On the other hand, you have this topic of conversation, which is a special counsel, that really both political parties are painting as a threat to America. The Republicans say that this special counsel investigation has been a witch hunt from the beginning, and that's a threat to our nation. And Democrats say, well, special counsel investigation is looking into the integrity of the White House, and that potentially could be a threat to the country. But part of the reason why we're having these hearings is to gather information, because we don't really have a complete picture yet. That's drastically different than what we know about bin Laden. Let me explain. One of the great benefits of the raid on the bin Laden compound was that we got full certainty about the threat that Al-Qaeda poses to America. And the reason why we have the full certainty of that and all the facts we need is that bin Laden kept amazing records of his letters with different associates over the years. And you can read some of these letters yourself. In fact, I'll put a link in case you want to peruse them. I've looked at them again over the last few days to refresh my memory. I often kept them on my computer on the desktop that I kept at work because there's no better source than the primary source, the leader of a terrorist group, to quote when you're talking about terrorism. And that's what we can do. If you look back through these letters, Osama bin Laden is very clear about how he feels about America. He calls us the lead infidel that they're going after. And he talks about the goal of setting up an Islamic State. And one of the things he talks specifically about in a few letters is Afghanistan, and that Americans don't really have the will to stay in Afghanistan or the same will to fight. And he felt if you could cut America at the trunk of a tree in Afghanistan, that the whole tree will fall over. And the threats that America poses to the survival of Al-Qaeda will not be the same. It's eerie to read some of these letters now because they're from so many years ago, and yet can raise a lot of questions about what we're doing in places like Afghanistan now. So the information is all there. The threat to America is very clear, yet how much do you really hear about that? Not that much. And on the other hand, we have these huge political debates. This time it's a special counsel investigation that really absorb a lot of the oxygen in the room. Those debates are really important to have questions about American leadership and the integrity of American leadership. These are key important questions that we should ask. And I'm not saying we should ask them. I'm just questioning whether or not we have our priorities straight. You know, last week there was another hearing on Capitol Hill that was talking about the global terrorism landscape. And in that hearing, a well-respected expert by both political parties said that Al-Qaeda has grown, the footprint of Al-Qaeda has grown, and it remains as much of a threat now as it ever has. Now, you heard about that on SmartHER News. Yeah, but you didn't hear about it very many other places. And that's one of the reasons why I asked whether or not we have our priorities straight. Is the biggest threat to America right now the enemy on the outside, the known enemy at times? Or is the biggest enemy the enemy within? The questions about threats that we have that lead to a feeling of divisiveness that maybe leads us to question whether or not we're as strong as a country. as we think. I couldn't help but wonder, just reflecting back on the horrible day of 9/11 and the terrorist attacks that we've experienced over the years, how much perspective that would bring this debate that we're having politically. If there was, God forbid, another terrorist attack like the one that we've seen in the past, how much would this debate matter to us if we felt our national security was really at risk? And part of the reasons we're able to have these huge, big public discourses and debates is because we have the freedom to do so and the safety to do so. And that's not the case everywhere around the world. So it's just something to remember. Sometimes it's easy to get frustrated at the divisiveness that we feel, but it's an exercise of our American freedom. We just have to keep it in the right perspective and also the right priority. So I'll leave you with that question. Are we prioritizing the threats correctly? I don't know. I think it depends on where you're standing, but it's an important question to ask. In the meantime, I really appreciate your ability to have debates on our different social media platforms. A lot of you had different opinions and you feel comfortable to share them, but you do so in a respectful way. And that's very unique to SmartHER News. And I'm really proud of that. So thank you for that. In the meantime, we're going to get back to work. We have a lot of news next week we're going to be looking at, and we appreciate your support as always. So have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.